Oh, let's hope the recorder doesn't make any sounds. Hello, everybody. My name is Abdullah. I can't tell you how excited I am to be back. I was actually born in Kuwait and haven't been back since then. So I just want to thank the entire team at Nuqat for bringing me here and believing in my work, and for this actually a wonderful conference that they put together. So actually, if we can give them a round of applause, because they deserve it. So, 1 second, the presentation isn't working properly. Yeah, the notes here. No, it's not working.
Press that, don't close the window. Done. There you go.
Okay, so my presentation is called "And They All Said She's in Culture Shock." So I have 20 minutes, probably of which I've wasted 2 minutes right now. And this thing is still not functioning. Okay, here we go. Okay, so a presentation expert once told me that if you can't say something in 20 minutes, you cannot say it at all. However, he was speaking to a room filled with PhD students who spend about 45 minutes discussing how awkward they are and their CVs. And so because I am a PhD student, I'm going to awkwardly flip through my credentials before I get to my point. So the first question I always get asked, because people are very curious, is where are you from? And so because this has been asked to me for the past, 27 years, I've kind of developed a foolproof answer to give to them. So on Mondays, I'm Mediterranean. On Tuesdays, I'm Arab. On Wednesdays, I'm Levantine. On Thursdays, I'm Palestinian. On Fridays, I'm Canadian. And on the weekend, I take a break from the identity gods. So this is my credentials. I also collect identities and degrees, as you can see. I am an MPhil PhD candidate in design at Goldsmiths, University of London. I'm a designer, a writer, an editor, and a researcher. I'm also the founder, editor, and creative director of Kalimat magazine, as well as run the Design Atelier, which is Kalimat's collaborative and interdisciplinary design studio. So my work sometimes is mostly visual communication, although I don't like mediums to limit me very much. So sometimes my work addresses political and social issues, highlights the power of visual communication. Often I do work for cultural organizations or organize exhibitions, or as fun, social, and cultural commentary. So this guy who told us how to speak also told me to start off with a story because it eases its way into the initial argument. And since Nuqat's theme is about culture shock, I'm going to talk to you about culture shock. So in June of 2010, I arrived at An-Najah University in Nablus. Having recently quit a job that people thought I was crazy to quit, I was as arrogant as ever, mainly because I was able to let go of material things, and this made me cool. I, Abdullah, 24 at the time, possessed more knowledge than anyone in this office. And when you're 24, you think you're invincible. I had my own way of doing things, and I was incredibly frustrated at the fact that almost everything was run by an outside organization. Everything had to be imported, even though people with perfectly good qualifications were right there. And stories were almost always told from a foreigner's perspective. That is my first form of culture shock. So I arrived home to a place that apparently is my home, in which I wasn't born in, and in where I've never lived, and where I was called the French who speaks Arabic. I was a crusader. I was a foreigner attempting to tell the natives what to do and how to do it, which made me no different than the initial problem that was frustrating me. Critiquing my surroundings was my defense against this culture shock. I grew up in Canada and I came to Palestine with ideas in my mind. Sometimes without realizing, these may be abstract concepts that just don't work. My attitude led those around me to resent me. Aggressive ridicule leads to avoidance, and I was growing more and more frustrated. But then something incredible happened. The people around me, although they still called me French, started adding "gada" to this description. So they started listening to my ideas. Why? It's because I began taking a different approach, developing solutions to every problem I talked about, and discussing these solutions with those around me. My boss at DDB, a gada woman in her own right, once told me not to mention a problem without a solution, and I took her advice to heart. At An-Najah, I was asked to teach a few English courses, but instead of teaching grammar, I chose to integrate elements such as group work, presentation, and research. An-Najah, like many educational institutions around the world, are notorious for a rote form of learning, which means that students spend time memorizing rather than learning, and rarely have the opportunity to engage with each other and their ideas. Although a very short time, I got to know the students very well, their thoughts, ideas, and goals. I realized that they had nowhere to write about their fascinating experiences for an international audience. Professors were not instilling any confidence in them, and they weren't going to grasp the language by merely understanding the book. That was the trigger for Kalimat. Kalimat acts as an open outlet for political, social, and cultural expression for Arabs in the region and its diaspora. It invites people to challenge the status quo, to share their ideas and opinions openly, and show the diversity of the region and the diaspora, as well as the diversity in the work Arabs worldwide do. We are independent because we want content to be as real and as unedited as possible. The publication is not a porte-parole for one view or another, it is a space for dialogue. Challenge the status quo also refers to the frustration with the 80-20 rule. 80% of people do nothing, and 20% of people act. Kalimat is that 20%, and we want people to act. Recently, we were faced with an issue where we had to challenge the status quo. One particular work, political in nature, was censored in an exhibition we organized in London called In the City. Rather than accept this as our fate and be the hypocritical publication that promotes free speech and stays silent when it is taken away, we organized a solo show for the designer in order for her to have her space to showcase her work. And even though we do not take specific political positions, to deny this designer's work from public display runs contrary not only against the principles behind artistic expression, but behind those which underpin any free, democratic society. So enough of this shameless self-promotion. We're going to go back to culture shock, which is, I feel, one of the consequences of the revolution. So culture shock is an old and subjective concept. Experiencing culture shock is not necessarily a negative. It leads to greater self-awareness and personal growth. According to many historians, when the Crusaders invaded Muslim lands in the Middle Ages, the Arabs encountered a form of culture shock. The main difference between the French, the name the Arabs gave to Crusaders, which coincidentally is my name in Palestine, and the Arabs was integration. The former learned the language and returned to Europe bearing many inventions from the Arabs. The Arabs, however, took no part in this. They felt as though they could learn nothing from the invaders. This stereotype of a barbaric Europe trapped in time was still in the minds of people when Napoleon conquered Egypt in 1798, but with Napoleon's conquest came the Arab rediscovery of Europe. Arabs again experienced culture shock, except this time, leaders, most notably Muhammad Ali in Egypt, showed a tremendous amount of respect, appreciation, and admiration to Western advances. Their ideas trumped the stereotype. One of Muhammad Ali's most ambitious modernization projects was the translation of Western books into Arabic. This mode of transmitting ideas was successfully exploited by the ancestors of the Arabs in the 9th century, who translated numerous Greek, Persian, and Indian works into Arabic. So how do we address culture? Well, the stereotype of the European is still very much there, and vice versa. It is mostly bitterness at the arrogance of its colonial conquests. Think about how we defend our identity when it is under attack. One of the most famous of arguments, which I'm sure many of you may have heard, is, "My ancestors were building civilizations while yours were still learning how to make fire." We blindly defend without facts. It is often the case that when we speak of the Arab world's culture, we refer back to the glory days of Islam. We talk about Fatimid Cairo, Abbasid Baghdad, and Andalusia. Sometimes we discuss the Nahda of the late 19th and earliest 20th century. And we often refer back to Europe's Renaissance only being a possibility that was brought on from Arab knowledge. The Arab revolutions brought with it a new spotlight on the Arab world. Suddenly, we went from war headlines to having Arabs on influential art lists. But who are we kidding? All of a sudden, people revolted and culture came into the region? That's an absurd statement. So why do we pretend it to be true? The creative class was no longer hidden. It now had more attention on it. There has always been creative activity. Of course, that is not to say that there has not been an increase in projects since the revolutions have created this. They have created the everyone's doing it, so why can't we? What I like to call it the jumping on the bandwagon syndrome, which actually you mentioned, Rose, but there is now more than ever state money being invested in infrastructures, as the Gulf, for example. And of course, we can debate how this money is being used, but it is being invested is the point that I'm trying to make. So things have changed in the past 10 years. I mean, look at the case of the Palestinian Film Festival, for example. In the 2000s, there were maybe one or two. Now even small cities host festivals and sell out seats in cinemas. There's much more interest. However, we need to be careful. It's now cool to be Arab, where it was almost shameful not so long ago. And anything cool will eventually fade out of the trend. I'm sure many people will recall what they wore in the 80s, but I apologize, I was very young, so I can't remember that unforgivable decade. What I would like to argue is that the Arab revolutions did not suddenly create the cultural industries in the Arab region, but rather it made them more apparent. However, an increase in initiatives is not always a positive. Many projects are an indiscriminate imitation of others, complete disregard for the place or the local. Further to this new attention initiates another problem, the enabler culture. I'm sure everyone here has sat down at a certain point and discussed film, design, or any other cultural project from the region. There is some good stuff, and of course, there's the bad. The argument here is of supporting the bad and the problematic, the work that reinforces the stereotypes, that has no thinking behind it. Its support makes it overtake the good, and people get nervous when you constructively critique it because their argument is, well, at least they're doing something. But for a region whose claim to fame is conflict, bureaucracy, and red tape, international communities cling to the work that is below average and plays the same record over and over again. The work with the niqab, the beards, the taboo topics that are really in bad taste. So stop being a cheerleader. A culture of criticism does not exist within the Arab cultural industry. We either praise bad work because, well, people are doing something, love work because we know the people behind it, or hate on it because it's cliquish. Further to this, I feel as though the revolutions have made everything that comes out of the region a product of the revolutions. This is not true, and it was actually the case with Kalimat. We launched online in November 2010, but everybody thought we launched due to the revolutions. By no means has the Arab world been sans culture before the revolutions. Sure, it is only recently that more initiatives have been taking place, but the concept of connectivity is something we also need to keep in mind. Now more than ever, we have access to the entire world through various communication networks, and old hierarchies and traditional roots are being challenged by new social networks. The internet allows for alternative spaces for creators to explore and share work. I want to say that we need to think about our intentions, have empathy. So what can we do? Here are some pointers. And I wrote manifesto here because designers love manifestos. It's just like their thing. This isn't a manifesto. I'm just kind of trying to give you a little guide. You can take it or you can tell me that I'm full of BS. Stop calling it Arabia or Middle East. Arabia does not refer to the Arab region. It refers to the Arabian Peninsula. Geography is important. If you're going to include terms such as Arabia or Middle East in your title or vision, you need to be sure of who this encompasses. I've come across many websites, associations, and so on that have the word Arab in the name, and the line beneath it says, covering the Middle East. Then there's the use of the Arabic script. Turkey, which is part of the Middle East, does not use the Arabic alphabet. Also, make sure that you don't mistake Muslim with Arab. It's not the same thing. Just because Turkey is a Muslim country doesn't mean that everybody reads Arabic script. And if you're going to include Middle East and only talk about Arabs, Iran is also part of this. So you need to understand who you're speaking to. Research, research, research. I can't say this enough. You need to do your homework. What's already out there? Can you work together if something exists? What is the type of work that is needed? Create a culture of collaboration. We're so busy trying to be original that we forget to collaborate. Don't look at others always as competition and become guarded and defensive, but you can see them as collaborators in your project. Stop naming things after Arabic letters. It doesn't sound as cool as you think. I mean, ABC is a silly name unless it's a Jackson 5 song. Think of a larger impact. If your project preaches change, as in something needs to change, then you should not be working in silos or talking only to friends. Some projects are highly closed, not inviting, and exclusive. Targeting important areas such as education and policy are key. Many projects are mostly ephemeral, which defeats the purpose. One of the major issues people discuss is the lack of strength that Arab institutions possess. They are not credible and they constantly lose substance. This is one area we should start working on. Who are you addressing? This is often a worry. As someone who has read a number of missions and visions, I am still confused as to the target. The use of language is one. Sometimes everything is in French or English, yet targeting the Arab world. Sure, many people read, write, and speak English and French, but it's not their first language. Second, many projects seem to attract one community, but they feel as if they're more universal. Sometimes it might be too Arab American for someone in London or Cairo to get it. At Kalimat, we try to be as clear as possible. We are by Arabs for everyone, which is why we publish in the English language. Be critical, constructively. Do not blindly support projects because they are from the Arab world, but rather critique those that are problematic by providing solutions to the problem. Do not blindly borrow ideas. I mentioned the lack of consideration for context. I think people feel that because an idea seems to have worked in one area, that it is sure to work in another. This is not the right attitude. Often, projects place too much emphasis on where success was gained, rather than look at how altering it for context would work. Do not plead Renaissance. This is a very complicated and loaded term that is being used too loosely to describe cultural activity in the region. I would hardly claim the current events are a renaissance or that they need to be labeled as a renaissance. Just like what many have labeled the Nahda of the late 19th and early 20th century, we cannot take the term literally. We cannot continuously cling to the past in hopes of regaining our lost grandeur. As Samit Amin has written in Eurocentrism, which by the way is an extremely difficult book to read, it's brilliant, but it'll take you 6 months. The Nahda did not understand the meaning of democracy properly understood as the right to break with tradition. It thus remained prisoner of the concepts of the state. The Nahda rather reduced modernity to the immediate appearance of what it produces, technical progress. Progress is not window dressing. It must be acted on. Change your defeatist attitude. I have constantly been in rooms and all I hear is complaint after complaint of there are no good Arab designers. There are no good designers in the Arab world. The schools are terrible, all the writers are bad, and so on and so forth. It is that deep-rooted feeling of helplessness, that there is no future for the Arab world, that fatalism and helplessness within Arab society has crippled the imagination, yes, even post-revolution. So stop self-orientalizing. This can be anything from the typical camel in the desert scene, an overuse of geometry, the arabesque typeface. So when it comes to mind to use it, I'll forgive you more for using Comic Sans. So don't complain, act. It is difficult to find solutions, but we have to find them. People are working hard to change things. With this selfish attitude, we discredit them. So I urge you to embrace the difficulties. And this is how you can ask me questions, and I would like to finish it off with a video that we did for the In the City exhibit, because I have exactly 2 minutes and 44 seconds before the end of this presentation. So enjoy, and hopefully you can hear it. Thank you very much.
Question and answers, other than how to perform such activities. Remember, you can also ask questions or comments on our Instagram. Please, the mic. I'll take it up. It's okay. Work. Mike?
Hello.
We're good.
Hi, I have a question. I myself am a designer, and I really, really like the guides that you came up with, and I really kind of feel it's something that I personally like to follow as well. But I have a question that's basically, how do you get other people to sort of see, or to see what you're trying to express, you know? If that makes sense? I don't know.
What do you mean? Because it is quite a broad question.
So we have great designers, but it's a matter of how do you get people to appreciate or see your ideals and your vision, you know?
Oh boy. It's a lot of education. I mean, it is extremely difficult. You know, I still think my parents don't know what I do. So, or they're like, well, what do you know, it's really, really difficult, but it's a lot of work, I think, within the educational system itself to get that appreciation for it. I mean, the best example, not that I always like to look at outside examples, but is definitely Scandinavia, where they've kind of built it within their culture, where everybody just appreciates design because it's kind of part of the lifestyle now. How I get people to appreciate it is I am able to talk about my work in a way that is understandable to people. And I think that this is something a lot of designers lack, unfortunately. We aren't able to really express what our work is about, and we need to learn how to do that, especially dealing with the region, because it's, I mean, again, if I can't convince my parents, I'm not that convincing yet, am I? So I don't know if that answers your question, but you can probably come talk to me after. We can have a huge debate about it if you like.